And welcome to Libertarian Counterpoint. With me today is Mr. Jason McPhee from the Knuckleheads of Liberty. And you know, Jason, there's a lot of discussions about threats to democracy these days. And you know, from a libertarian perspective, or from our perspective, they're correct. Now, we just have a vastly different perspective about what's actually a threat to democracy. So one of the things we find kind of a threat, or at least conceptually, is Douglas Mackey has been convicted essentially for tweeting that people should vote online or vote through text or something like that. Okay, you probably shouldn't do that.
Well, and just to lay the background for it, it was a joke trying to get Hillary voters to try to vote online on the day of the election when they couldn't actually do that. Yeah, it was supposed to be a joke meme. But.
And these kind of things, these kind of joke memes are around all the time. Hey, make sure you vote Wednesday, right? This has been going around since as long as I can remember, right? And I'm 52 years old, been voting since I was 18. Yeah, this has been around, right? Hey, make sure you vote Wednesday. You know, if you think you're not the person, you're not going to vote. It's a common joke. And I guess they got some group to say that this guy has 58,000 followers on Twitter, so therefore he's a top 10 influencer on Twitter. And like, how is some dude with 58,000 followers a top influencer? None of this stuff makes any sense, but yet now we've convicted someone for making a meme about joking people to vote on the wrong way or the wrong day, which is a common occurrence all throughout history. There's something very dangerous about the thought process here.
Well, you know what I find a little bit odd about this too is that the way a lot of these influencers work is that it's people who agree with them who look at their posts. So it's people who would have been laughing about it, knowing it was a joke most likely, that would be tuning into this guy. So it's not like this guy had a ton of Hillary followers, right?
Yeah.
Which means that, you know, who did it really impact? I don't know.
No, it's a bunch of people who agreed with them laughing about a joke that's only funny to them, right? And to the rest of us, stop it, you know, and we just kind of move on about our life. And that's kind of the problem, is we're now wasting, you know, time and money and resources that we don't have to prosecute people for a meme.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and he was potentially facing up to, I believe it was up to 10 years, but he got sentenced to like, what was it, 7 or 8 months or something like that?
Yeah, so it's still ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly.
It's still insane, the fact that you can get, even for joking about, you know, when an election happens or how to vote or something, you know, that's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous, you know, road to go, because now our comedians, if you say that at a comedy show, are you now going to have the same issue?
Well, and we saw this too over in England and other places like this. There was some guy with a little pug, and he taught the pug to, his little pug dog, to, when he saw Hitler on television, to give a little salute. And so apparently he sent that online so that his girlfriend would see it as a joke. And other people saw it, and somebody was offended. And because somebody was offended, he was actually arrested and taken to jail because he offended people, which is, you know, really disturbing. But they don't have a First Amendment there.
Yeah, it always seems like it's worse to offend somebody than to lock somebody in a cage, right? Yeah. That's somehow, locking somebody in a cage is less offensive than offending somebody over a joke.
Yeah.
I just don't see how you can morally say locking someone in a cage is an appropriate response to a offensive joke. I just don't, I can't wrap my head around that.
There's one other aspect to this that's really disturbing too, and should disturb everybody out there who's ever passed on a meme, is that this Douglas Mackey says he didn't actually generate the meme. He simply passed it on to his followers. So if you literally are passing on jokes and you happen to be funny and popular, you're taking on a massive risk now, according to the government. So that's really
well. Have you seen some
scary.
of the stuff that comes from Occupy Democrats around election time? I mean, are they going to hold them to the same standards that they're holding this guy to? I'm just saying, you know, there's some things that are just so widely disturbing that we're now having political prosecutions.
And weaponization of government.
Yeah, I mean, if someone had made a joke about that, about Trump supporters, I mean, we're sure there's a meme trying to get Trump supporters to vote the wrong way or the wrong day. There's ones out there. Did they go off and look for that one? Of course not. And so that's really the problem. I mean, above all the other problems, that's the major problem, is the selective prosecution of these type of things. And because we know it is. We know that it's a selective prosecution. And what Democrats don't understand is if Democrats can be selective prosecutions, well, now you've just opened up Republican prosecutors to do selective prosecutions. And where do we go from there? When you have Democrat prosecutors doing selective prosecution, you have Republican prosecutors doing selective prosecution, and literally nobody's safe.
Yeah.
And so,
This is really where the danger of going away from the clear principle of free speech. Free speech should be pretty much absolute. Just if you have an issue of maybe fraud or somebody is imminent threat is what they're giving you with their speech, then maybe those things might be, something you need to be a little bit careful on. But everything else, just take a breath and let it go.
yeah, well, yeah, being offensive from being offensive is this, it's the response we have, well, you're offensive, so we're going to lock you in a cage. Is locking someone in a cage is a worse thing than
it's pretty offensive.
I can't wrap my head around that. Okay, yeah. CNN has an opinion the other day about a third-party run is a risk that somehow democracy can't afford, more than 2 parties running for president. It's somehow people engaging in democracy is a threat to democracy.
Well, Nancy Pelosi literally said on an interview that this was a threat to democracy, which is what your title of your story is that this new party called the No Labels Party, and the fact that the guy from Manchin, Joe Manchin, might actually run as the presidential candidate in that party. He hasn't announced it yet, but he has announced he's stepping down from his senatorial seat, and he would be somebody who potentially has a lot of middle-of-the-road credibility out there. So,
yeah, and the reality is, it's not a danger to democracy; it's a danger to their power. And that's what they're actually saying. When they're saying it's a threat to democracy, it's not a threat to democracy, because democracy is ugly, it's messy, right? And you have to kind of accept that there's going to be rough spots. What they're really complaining about is it's a threat to their power. Yeah. And that's should actually send everybody's kind of necks or spider senses, whatever it is you should be tingling all over the place when people are saying this kind of thing. Because they're saying that I just said it again, I'm going to have to repeat myself, but participating in democracy is a threat to democracy.
Yeah, it's sort of like if you're participating, you have a choice. As long as you take the choice of voting for me, then everything's good. If you're going to vote for somebody else, that's a threat. This is, Russian collusion or something else, right, is what we've been hearing all this time. The bottom line is, we need to take a step back and just say, hey, look, the real solution is just reduce the size and scope of what government does. Then most people won't really care that much about what it is if government doesn't have its hands in everything.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we talk about a lot, but we don't talk about a lot as a community, as a culture, is that the more government does, the bigger government is in your life, the bigger role it plays in your life, the more important these decisions are, which is why we're fighting so fiercely over smaller and smaller issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So everything becomes a threat, and especially too, when you elect one person and it affects a whole market basket of what you do, right? So it's not like everything is disaggregated. When you select that one person, that one party, suddenly everything is tied together. Your rights to vote, maybe your rights to freedom of worship, all these different things are all tied together. And your right to not be locked down or to be locked down, all these things. You're getting one brand covers everything. So if you lose one thing, you've lost it all.
Well, and especially now that they're getting the education is becoming more and more politicized. Once we allow politicization in our education system, it's kind of over for our culture, because the only way to fix that is to get your kids out of it, because otherwise you're just going to get the education the politicians want you to have. You're not going to get the education your kid actually needs. And that's one of those things that's been proven for decades across the world in places like the Soviet Union, Russia, China. You don't get the education you need, you get the education they want you to have. And and so that is a danger. Richard Fields actually has a perspective on danger. One of the things third parties don't have is a lot of money. We wish we could print some, but printing money is a danger to democracy, and Richard has a perspective on that, and let's hear what he's got to say.
This is Richard Fields with Reports from the Fields. Recently, I came across something called the Cloward-Piven strategy. Back in 1966, Frances Piven, a professor of political science and sociology at City University of New York, and her now deceased husband, Richard Cloward, wrote an article for The Nation, an ultra liberal progressive magazine. In their article, they advocated encouraging as many people as possible to take advantage of local welfare programs. The goal was to financially overload the system at the local level so the feds would have to take over. Ultimately, they wanted government guaranteed income for all with no work requirements. In a word, socialism. That goal seems to be nearly attained. But is it? Defining welfare very broadly to include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans' pensions, and a host of other income assistance programs, the federal government spends $3.9 trillion a year on it. That's $12,000 for every man, woman, and child living in the country. That's on the paying side. Total federal revenue from all sources is 4.9 trillion. That means that welfare spending is 65%, nearly two-thirds of federal revenue. Add defense spending, interest payments, and all the regulatory agency spending, and you have an explanation for the 1.4 trillion and growing federal deficits as far as the eye can see. In fact, all this welfare spending plus interest on the debt will exceed revenue 8 years from now. That's according to the government's own projections. Moody's just downgraded U.S. Treasury bonds from stable to negative. The other two major credit rating agencies have already downgraded U.S. debt. Riskier loans require higher interest rates. In 10 years, the Social Security Trust Fund will be empty. Maybe the Cloward-Piven strategy will backfire. It's one thing to force local governments to a fiscal breaking point to promote federalization of welfare. But once the feds are broke, and they are very close, there is no larger entity to push the debt burden to. The modern monetary theory so-called economists think we can just print our way out of the problem. But Argentina is an object lesson in why that won't work. Printing money eventually causes inflation. It's now over 140% in Argentina. And this Sunday, Javier Milei, a bona fide libertarian, may get elected president of Argentina, largely by campaigning against the Argentine Central Bank and its money printing to pay for Peronist welfare programs. I'm pretty sure that is not what Frances Piven and Richard Cloward had in mind, but that's what they could get. I'm Richard Fields, and that's my report from the fields. See you again next week.
You know, we as libertarians have been complaining about this printing money for decades. You know, this notion, this printing money is eventually going to catch up with us, and it is. I mean, all you have to do is go to the grocery store, and you know that that's printing money is the cause of that. It's the $30 trillion in debt that we have, and all that's printed money. And so, I mean, what did we expect to happen?
Yeah, it's ultimately what you really want is sound money. You just want to have the government out of the money system. I mean, this is what I think most people don't realize, but I mean, all money is a system of promises we make to each other. I mean, you do something for me, and maybe you're not getting something today, but I'm promising to do something for you tomorrow. Or I'm saying that somebody else will do in kind for you what you did for me by taking this little promissory note and handing it to somebody else. Well, what we're doing when we let the government have control of those promissory notes, the government is increasing the supply of the promissory notes. It didn't increase the supply of the work we did for each other. It just simply increased the number of promises in there. And what it's doing is, ex post facto, it's literally just diluting those promises is all it's doing. So it's really it's criminal, but that's what we've done.
And we have to remember, money is just a replacement for chickens or cows or you know, whatever it is, you know, bales of hay, you know, whatever it is you had to sell, you know, to make money is, you know, your neighbor who has, you know, the hay and you have chickens, maybe great. Hey, you exchange some chickens for some hay or some eggs for some hay. Okay, great. But what happens if you need a radiator?
Yeah.
That becomes it's harder too. The blacksmith doesn't need chickens or he needs steel, and and so that's why we actually came up with money, because the barter system has extreme limitations. Yeah, you can work. A barter system can work in a small, isolated community where you don't actually need a lot of things from the outside. But the minute you need to extend that, the minute you get past, say, 100 people, you need something more than a barter system, simply because the economics is too complex for the barter system to function properly. Talking about function properly, Jason, the New York High Court is hearing a redistricting case, because Democrats got mad that Republicans won some seats they weren't supposed to. So now they're going to go and redistrict them. But apparently they didn't do it the way they were constitutionally supposed to, but they did it anyway. So now the High Court's going to decide if they can do that or not. And again, this is the people who complain about, gerrymandering when Republicans do it. They complain about, all this manipulating of elections. But here we go. They weren't happy with the results of an election, so they're manipulating the next one.
Yeah, and it's just sad. I mean, all we see is time after time, all we see is ways that people are trying to manipulate what happens here. And it really gets back to what we were talking about earlier. I mean, you put a lot of concentrated power there in government, and you're going to have a lot of people that are going to want it to go their way. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's just, it's too bad.
Yeah. And the more and more power government has, the more and more incentive they have to want to control that power. And the bigger fear they have of someone else being in control of that power, because the things we're doing, well, then someone else can do those to us. And we don't want that to be able to happen, right? That's really what they're doing. We have manipulated and done all kinds of machinations to the electoral system. But if these people get in power, they're going to do the same things to us and shut us out just the way we've shut them out. And so we have to prevent that from happening. But rather than take some reflection and say, even in these manipulated districts, somehow we got beat by these bumpkins, and maybe that's a reflection on us. No, they're just going to change the system rather than reflect and say we're not actually doing what the citizens actually want. We're being too narrow in our worldview. No. We can't do that. We can't change how we operate. No. We're going to change and manipulate the system. You said it's sad. I say it's criminal. It's many things on these things, and it's just hard for us to know. It's hard for the average citizen to keep up with these things, because especially if you're a Democrat or if you're a Republican and you hear them pointing their fingers at the other guys for doing this, but all you have to do is scratch the surface and they're all doing it. Yeah.
Yep, it's just one of those things where when you concentrate power in government, you're always going to lead to such bad behavior and concentrated interest trying to make it go their way, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and we've got another talking about, we're talking about threats to democracy. If you are an investigative journalist, this might very well be a difficult time to engage in your career. There was a journalist who is refusing to divulge her sources in it's a civil case, which actually makes it even a little stranger, a little different than what we're normally used to. Essentially, there was this woman who was being investigated by the FBI. This investigative reporter got some information about it and reported upon it, but the FBI never pressed any charges, never kind of pursued it, passed an investigation. And so now the person who was at the focal point of the investigation is now suing a journalist for reporting upon the story. And they want their sources because she thinks the sources is within the FBI. And of course, journalists, a good investigative journalist doesn't reveal their sources. And so, most of the time we talk about the threat from government, but this is the time it's a threat from a civil lawsuit. And so it's a little different. It's actually a little different because it's another person trying to get access to, personal private information. And it's a fine line for us. This is a difficult one actually for libertarians because it's not the government we're actually kind of fighting here. It's another person who's trying to resolve an issue with, reputation, right?
Yeah. And it sounds like it's a judge in the civil case is saying that she needs to essentially turn over who she got her information from. But what I think is a little bit odd is that I could understand a little more if there were a question of whether the information was true, but in this case, she was simply reporting, it sounds like, on whether or not this other person was being investigated by the FBI, and since we know that she was being investigated by the FBI, I mean, I think the FBI has admitted to investigating her, and then they dropped it.
Yeah, they dropped the case.
Yeah.
It wasn't interesting enough. There wasn't, maybe there was, it's about, and it was kind of a minor case, right? It was about lying on her immigration documents, right? So it's a relatively minor case. The investigation probably didn't go nowhere. Or it's probably one of those things, we may or may not convict her, so we're not going to bother. Right,
yeah.
And so they let it go, and now she wants her reputation back. But you don't actually have a right to a reputation. That's kind of the interesting thing on this case. You don't actually have a right to a reputation.
Yeah, and that's something I kind of learned about from Walter Block's book, Defending the Undefendable, and he also talks, I think, about Murray Rothbard bringing some of the stuff out. But your reputation lives in other people's heads. It's not literally your property, so you can't quite define what it is other people are going to think about you. Now it does stink if somebody's going to spread a bunch of lies about you, but in the end, you don't actually own what's in other people's head.
Yeah,
so,
and it'd be one thing if there were lies, but she wasn't lying. She was just reporting on information that she would rather have not had reported. Now maybe the information was wrong, but that's the FBI's responsibility, not hers. And so anyway, it's a danger and something we should be careful of, because essentially I don't think she's looking at jail time, but she's looking at hefty fines.
Yeah, but this is really disturbing, because I mean, in the end, as a public, we want there to be a free flow of information to us about what's happening out there, and if government is going to start putting the clamps on reporters, and essentially this is really what we're seeing with Julian Assange too. He's in jail for telling us about what the government was doing, and the government simply didn't want us to know what they were doing, and that's apparently a crime now. It's really sad.
Yeah, well, there is another journalist thing that we can speak out about that is actually more serious than this one. A cartoonist in the Washington Post posted a cartoon about Hamas. It was a Hamas character and he had little children strapped to him, right? And so apparently, but the Washington Post pulled the cartoon. A couple days later, they had so much backlash, and the Washington Post pulled the cartoon, and the cartoonist, told everybody to grow up. This is America. You're going to have differences of opinion, and my job as a political cartoonist, satirist, is to actually say the uncomfortable things. That's his role in society, is to say uncomfortable things. And you do it in a cartoon because it's actually easier to digest that, to start digesting these kind of ideas that way.
And to, just to flesh it out a little more, the idea was that there was this Hamas person, and the idea was recently this story between Palestine and Israel is that Hamas terrorists are hiding behind children, is what the allegation is, and therefore the cartoon has this Hamas spokesperson with all these babies tied to him, and some people literally complained to the newspaper saying they thought it was racist. So that's where this goes, and it's just, and so then the newspaper then folded, but they kind of left the cartoonist hanging out high and dry as a racist, right? Which is just terrible. So,
yeah, well, and because in today's culture, that's the key word to use, right? You're just throwing the word out there. It doesn't even have to make sense. You just kind of throw it out there, and I hate to use the term, it's a dog whistle for a group of people to not have to hold responsibility for their, shall we say, fragile egos or fragile emotions.
Yeah, it is disturbing though. I mean, how many newspapers and other things are willing to cave so easily to any threats or fears that they have out there? We saw this too with the idea of publishing images of Muhammad in the cartoons and such. In Charlie Hebdo, you had this issue in France where they that was a publication there where they published a cartoon that had the image of Muhammad, and it wasn't very flattering, and so terrorists showed up and killed the people in the newsroom. So that's a pretty horrifying thing. But since then, a lot of news organizations have been on tiptoes around these types of issues, and this isn't exactly the same thing, but there are some parallels.
Yeah, if our journalists, if the institutions, our news organizations aren't willing to stand up for their cartoonists, aren't willing to stand up for, their journalistic integrity, then how can we trust them to tell us the truth about what the government is doing? How can we tell them to tell the truth about what science is doing? Or how can we expect them to tell the truth about anything, really? Because they've proven to not have the backbone. If they're willing to print it, but they're not willing to stand behind it. Say, hey, we don't necessarily agree with it, but it's a perspective that's out there. It's a perspective that exists in the world, and we have the kind of a moral authority, a moral duty to report on this. And if you're not willing to do that, what are you? You're a propagandist, right? You're no longer a news organization. You're a propaganda organization because you're only willing to say what it is a certain group of people want to hear.
I didn't know we had any news organizations that weren't propaganda organizations at this point.
Well, that, Jason, might very well be true, but that's a different issue. Okay, we got like a minute and a half. So there is a whistleblower. The FBI that has alleged the FBI is purging Christians, conservatives, and COVID skeptics. Now, the COVID skeptics, things we knew, right? Anybody who refused the vaccination was getting let go, fired, and so we knew that there was a purge of the people who were skeptical of that type of governmental power. And it doesn't surprise me, and in fact, if conservatives under this stage are getting, especially those who may have some support of Trump, that would actually not surprise me. Now, if people are actually going through and just purging random Christians, would actually surprise me. The other two don't, right? It's kind of expected, sad, but expected in the modern day. But it's proposing just kind of random Christians. If a Biden supporting Christian somehow doesn't seem to me that we'd get.
Well, one of the things that's a little bit scary is that, and this was happening, we saw this near the end of Trump's term, but he started blowing the whistle on some of these DEI trainings and other things like that were happening within federal agencies. And if you think about what that's doing, is it's really sort of setting the culture in those agencies to be much more aligned with the left. And so therefore, they may be weaponized against the people who don't fall in that line.
Yeah, because DEI is a political thing, right? Mm-hmm. Whether we like it or not, it is political. And we are out of time. We want to thank you for joining us with you. Thank you, Jason, for being with us. And, please remember to love everybody and good night.